Hello friends, my name is Christopher and I just got done building this beautiful shed. Let me tell you all about it.
Da 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 da.
Real quickly as we begin, this is a feature-length version of the build, going through everything that I did in detail. If you want a high-level overview just for fun, I've got a 4-minute time-lapse of the whole process and a 9-part video series going into specific topics throughout the shed that could be really helpful if you're doing something similar of your own. So without further ado, let's get started.
Why, hello friends. Alright, let's begin. I'm sitting down at my computer inside my house and I am just watching each clip as it goes by and doing some recordings. I figure I'm just going to talk about what I see on screen. And you know, if you want a really good deep dive for each of these, do check out any of the parts in the series. So we begin here by prepping the space, and in the last frame I was looking at the space where it was going to be, kind of walking it out, and here I'm using my new Fisker's tool and I'm just cutting down some limbs from the trees and then going crazy with the chainsaw. Timber! Very satisfying to watch that fall. I had help that day from my buddy Sean. He helped me move all sorts of brush that was there. Aside from the tree that fell, there was a Mughal pine, there were a whole bunch of roots that I ripped up, and finally it was cleared. So after a couple days, of course, springtime, you just gotta take your time, I went and I started digging trenches. Now my shed is built upon two 12-foot 6x6 green treated skids. And for me, my city ordinance said anything above 100 square feet needs to be on a concrete foundation. So this is 96 square feet. Underneath that, skids were just fine. I'm digging a trench less than a foot deep, and I'm filling it in with gravel, which we'll see here in a moment. And the gravel is packed about 4, 5, 6 inches. You can kind of use that to help level out your skid, you know, lower in some places, higher in others. It was a pretty effective process. We started the whole thing back in May. It took place over about 8 weeks. If you watch the time-lapse video, 8 weeks and 4 minutes, you'll know that. But it was nice to do some of this early work when it was real cool. I don't know about you, but when I'm lifting heavy logs and digging trenches, I get real sweaty. So it was nice to be working in 50 and 60 degree weather. And as you saw, I had help there from my best little helper, my daughter Charlotte, and my dog Moose. Help does make the work go quicker, but for me, I ended up doing this shed entirely by myself, with a few exceptions. Once upon a time, my wife helped me raise some walls, she's held some ladders, and most importantly, she's given me the time to do this while watching my daughter. And my buddy Sean also helped. He was the one clearing away these woods, and he held the ladder and helped me with shingles near the end. So here I am, and I'm making sure everything is parallel and level. In this shot in particular, I'm going from angle to angle with a tape measure. If that measurement is the same, then you know they are parallel with each other. And then checking it with the level, so I know that the left-right is correct, the front-back is correct. It's important to be as accurate as possible up in the beginning, because those inaccuracies really do add up and multiply if you continue them through the whole process. Well, if that's not just an artsy shot making it look like my chop saw's breathing in and out sawdust, I don't know what is. Don't worry, there's not too many shots here of me just cutting wood, because that would be boring, but I did want to say, if you have an opportunity to have some sort of a horse here that can hold long boards, it is quite helpful. Holding down a 12-foot board with just the plate there on the table saw, or the chop saw, would be pretty tough. So I'm essentially cutting out the 12-foot rims and the joists to go in between here, and laying out the marks for those as outlined on my blueprints.
Charlotte, are you helping Daddy build a shed?
Uh-huh.
Yeah?
Hi.
What are you doing?
Relax.
Mm-hmm.
I love that my daughter wants to be included on my projects. Of course, I kept her away when I was doing heavy hammering and we had earmuffs on her, but she had fun playing in the rocks and moving things with me. It's a philosophy on parenting to include them as much as possible. So once she left, as you can see, I got to pound in my first nail. And just a little fact about this, I chose to go with a framing hammer, 22 ounce by Fisker's for this entire project. I did not use a pneumatic nailer. Of course, if you had a nail gun, it would go a lot quicker and it would be easier, but my right bicep, man, I turned into a beefcake. It's terrific. I'm following my plans as far as the layouts here, so I'm not going to go into that too much. iCreatables.com if you're looking for some shed plans yourself. That zoom out was from some angle clips just to provide a little bit of additional structure between the rim and joist onto the skids, and of course that is toe-nailed in as well. And then we move on to applying some contact adhesive and laying on the floor. Contact adhesive is a great additional step that you may not think of. I know I didn't initially, but that will reduce the creaking in the floorboards over the life of the shed. And then of course it's nailed in too. It's nailed in every 6 inches along the perimeter and then every 12 inches on the inside. Now I went with 3/4 inch treated plywood here. All those rims and joists are also treated just closer to the ground. If I had to do it again, I would do some tongue and groove floorboards. They just weren't available. There was some supply chain lag when I was buying this during the time of the COVID pandemic and quarantine. The footage is pretty straightforward. You start off with an 8-foot board on one side, then you move on to a 4-foot, and then on the opposite side you do an 8-foot and then another 4-foot for my 12-foot base. You know, you just don't want that seam to be going the entire way down. You kind of want that brickwork pattern like I have. And then when you're all done, you've got a stage to dance a hearty jig. With the foundation and the floor finished, now you've actually got a footprint for seeing how this is going to live in your space. That was really rewarding for me to see. It's also nice because it serves as a platform to work on. I'm going to be using this floor in this section here to actually build all of my roof rafters. Well, it's nice, you'll see in a second just quite why, but for my roof in this case, it's a 10/12 slope, so that's 40 degrees at the top, 50 degrees at the bottom, and it just looks lovely. We chose that aesthetically to mimic the architectural style of our house, and it's a lot of repetitive cuts. Personally, I don't do a lot of angled cuts, so this was good practice for me here, but it's important to be as accurate as possible. It would have been nice if I had a stop block at the end of those wings on my horse to make sure every cut was exactly the same from board to board. It was maybe inaccurate, an 1/8 or 1/4 of an inch here and there, and those carried over to some waviness in the wood that no one would ever know about, but just something to keep in mind. Now, here we can talk about using the floor as a template. You can see I've got the top, the peaks of those boards lined up on the seam, 4-foot from 4-foot, the diagonal pieces up at the top and exactly in the corner, and then the transom piece on the bottom lines up flush with the end of the floor. And that serves as a good template. So I just screwed in some extra 2x4 pieces, and I can use that to make sure all the rest of them are the exact same. This time lapse here is me cutting a whole bunch of gussets. There's gussets on each side of the rafter, at the peak and at the 2 ends, and it just took forever. So here I am stretching and being thankful that it's all done. And then it's time to put the gussets on. Not a whole lot to consider here. You're making a gusset wood sandwich, essentially. You gotta make sure that the gusset doesn't overlap on top of the 2x4s, otherwise your sheathing won't lay flat when you get to that stuff and you'll be really upset. I put 5 or 6 nails in each board on each side of the gusset. So take care of that on one end, pull it out of the template, and then I just flipped it right on over and did the same on the other side. So that template, like I said, really handy for sliding those boards in and repeating your accuracy. Wonderful. It really is a satisfying day's worth of productivity. Not the hardest part, just repetitive, so the tedium comes in making and nailing in all those gussets. And once that was complete, we moved on to clearing the space because I made a lot of sawdust. And I do mark on the front and the back end 3.5 inches. We'll be using that when we raise the roofs, but it seemed like a good time. And we're moving on to framing the walls. So for the 12-foot and the 6-foot pieces, you've got the top and the bottom. Make sure that they are the exact same length. Clamp them together, and then you transfer your markings over. And those markings are essentially so you've got 16 inches on center for your studs, or whatever your plans happen to say. And you can see that I'm using the floor here as a stand for me to put the walls on, because the floor is 8 feet wide and these walls are 7.5, something like that. So it's handy to be able to nail everything in on a wooden space as opposed to in the grass. For me, it's 2 nails in the end of each, and keeping them as close to right angle 90 degrees as possible. Of course, you can correct that in the end when you're actually standing the walls, but like I've said before, keep those inaccuracies as controlled as you can, otherwise they'll add up. Now here I'm cutting just an extra scrap of the plywood that I had here to make my trimmer for above the door and the window, which is just an OSB sandwich between 2 extra 2x6 pieces. And if you've obviously, if you've built a door or a window, you know what I'm talking about here, but if you haven't, the whole purpose of framing windows and doors is you transfer the weight, the load-bearing weight of everything that's on the roof around the window, you know, into the trimmer, into the king stud, and these other boards that you have here, so that you're not going to be crushing the window or the door and deforming it over time. So I go into this in greater detail on the deep dive, but you can see I've got my king stud, my inner boards, my center stud below the window. Do that the same for both of my ends are windowed ends, so they're built the same. And the door, we don't have a lot of footage for building the door, because that's the same thing as building the back wall or this, except you've got a great big door opening. Now, fortunately for me, I had a lot of space in my backyard. It became my build site. You can see the rafters in one other part. Here I built the other end wall, and in the next shot I'm just pulling over the door. But if you don't have the space, good luck. Yeah, that's a good extra hint. Make sure you've got the space. When we were building it, this is just an aside, and figuring out where this was going to go, I almost didn't cut down that first arborvitae tree. I think I had 14 feet worth of space between the compost pile and the tree, so it would have been real tight. And I'm so glad I cut it down, otherwise it just would not have been possible moving around. You can see how tight that fit is. So we move on then to actually raising the walls, and here's my wonderful and beautiful wife Bridget. She's helping hold this for me while I tack in a couple ends. Straightforward. What I'm looking at with my feet there is lining up the inside of the 2x4 bottom with that line that I had drawn earlier. Excuse me. They get nailed in every 16 inches, 2 nails next to each other, and I'm following the stud lines for the joists on the floor. That's really visible at this point because you can see the nails on the floor where you were nailing when you were doing the floor and foundation. Well, once you put up the sidewalls, it becomes nice and rigid because you nail them into the floor and then you nail it into each other, and whew, talk about satisfying. For me, I did front, side, and back. There was a little bit of error that I was accumulating in the very back right corner. Again, nobody sees that, not even the neighbors, because of the fence. I was building this section in the early part of June, and the temperatures had risen to the upper 80s, I think even the 90s in some days, so I was working up a great sweat. And I think I lost probably 5 pounds over the 4 weeks doing this, just because I was out there, and it was great cardiovascular work when you're not using a nail gun and you're just framing it all by hand. I highly recommend it if you're in good physical shape. And you also learn how to properly swing a hammer. By the time when it was done, I felt quite skilled. Here I am putting up the caps. I forget the actual term for them, but these provide some additional rigidity. So this is a full 8-foot board that I'm putting on top of the wall, because the wall stud itself is, I think, 7 feet, 5 inches. So you can see I've got that 3.5-inch overhang, and it creates what I'll call a brick pattern. You want to just do that because you're locking in that piece into the front piece. It's good. And then I'm cutting the board that goes along the 12-foot section, so that's 12 feet less 3.5 times 2, so 11 feet 5 inches. And you can see it slides right in between there. It's also nice to have that double thick cap when you're putting on the roof. It will provide some more rigidity. So now it's time to get the OSB sheathing that I'm using. I'm sheathing mine instead of just putting on panels of siding, and it's really helpful to have a tool or a friend so you can carry those along. But that nail I just put in was to help me hold this up. I think the important part for me to remember was that it should have maybe a 1/4 inch reveal or a 1/2 inch reveal from the very top, so that when I'm putting the roof on, I wasn't going to be putting it on top of plywood. Fun cameo for my wife and daughter there. Here's just a reminder to keep an 1/8 of an inch gap between each board as it expands and contracts. I was going to talk about rigidity just a moment ago. Once you line up the side, you put 2 nails there, and you put your 3rd nail across the top, it does lock the structure in place, so it'll be permanently rigid, and so it just pays to be accurate. Here I've been using a jigsaw to cut some parts flush with the outside. I did the exact same thing for the inside of the window. We saw that silly cutaway just a bit ago. I'm always pleased when I get something right, so you'll see the sort of thumbs ups from me. And fun fact, my least favorite tool to use is the circular saw. I'm just not good at it, but I had to use it a lot in this project, so I got good at it. Here I am cutting off the bottom of the frame where the door is, so you're not walking into it and stumbling. Pretty easy to do, just this is the right time to do it. And here I am putting up some extra supports. Next up I'm going to be putting up the roof rafters. Whoa, there go my lobbers. So many things fell. But I'm trimming up some more trees as I do it. Those extra 2x4s just help me hold up this outermost rafter right here, as you can see. These are, in my case, I line them up at the very front of my shed. Depending on what you're doing, you might do things differently. And what I should have done was run a string between the peaks of the outermost rafters and then lined up all the center ones with that. I forgot to, so there was a little bit of waviness that I referred to earlier, but that all got covered up with the sheathing and such. Here I'm putting on some fascia on the front and the back, again just to hold those roof rafters in. Extra steps and tight spaces that I'm working in. I like when I get a good camera shot like this. I was going up and down a ladder so many times. Okay, honestly, those boards are so heavy to lift up there, it would have paid to have some help, but after some successes and failures, I did finally figure out a way to raise them, keep them in place, and nail them on safely. I figured it was important to show the progress as I succeeded after failing multiple times. And here it's just satisfying video watching all those pieces go on. Now, fun thing to note, this is the same kind of layering pattern, that brickwork pattern as we had with the floor. Start with a whole 8-foot section, then a 4-foot, and then you offset these different cuttings so you close the space. It makes sense when you're doing it. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. This is an important piece of footage. I decided to put a vertical piece additionally to my my outside rafter, so you can see that I added a transom to it. And here I am cutting some triangle boards and finishing out the fascia on the outside. I think I mentioned this earlier, but remember your outside rafters don't have gussets on them on the outside because the fascia is what ties it all together. So it's even from the body up into the rafters. And then it was time to put on the vapor barrier. I'm just gesturing here to the nail in the studs. Make sure you're nailing it to studs for your vapor barrier with staples. I'm using cap nails. I had extra ones for my roofing underlay. And I'm starting and finishing at the door, so as I cut, I just wrap that and tack it in appropriately around the door frame. Then you move up. I've got a 3-foot section of vapor barrier here, so I only had to do 3 rows of it, overlapping about 5 or 6 inches each row. And you can see I've got it on top of an extendable paint rod. That's a handy dandy trick that I saw from another YouTuber. I highly recommend it, so you're not dealing with roll on the ground while you're standing 8 feet in the air. It's great. When you've got those all tacked in your studs, it's time to make sure you seal every single gap or additional hole you might have put in. There's vapor barrier tape. You'll probably find it right next to your vapor barrier. Easy to go on, easy to rip, but let me tell you, once it's on, so don't make any mistakes. It's really sticky stuff. As I'm finishing off the peak here, I just threw some extra overlay, tacked it up onto the roof. I cut that off when I was up there doing overlay or underlay in the future, but. And then I'm finishing off the door, again just cutting it off at the threshold, making it look nice. That gets covered up by trim later on. Now that I've wrapped my shed up like a mummy, I have to cut out my 2 windows using an I method. Cut at the top, cut at the bottom, and then right down the middle. And you fold those on the inside, and then you cut and you wrap them appropriately on the outside. Check out a walkthrough on a different channel or a Reddit feed, you'll find the right way to do it. And then there was rain. Once the rain was done, after 2 weeks, it got even hotter. Yay! But all of my material had finally arrived, and it was time to start the siding. Now I'm using bevel cedar siding, and a lot goes into it. I'm particularly fond of this individual breakout video that I've got in the Part 9 series. I think this is Part 6. I'm applying an exterior grade protective oil, clear, just because I love the amber color of the cedar that has to go on all faces. And after you make a cut, you have to reapply as well. So I apply, and then I let them stand for a bit, and I move on. I had so many boards to do. Straightforward, again, pretty easy, just time-consuming and tedious, but very satisfying to see that color come out in the middle of the day and realize that's going on my shed. I opted for cedar, probably for the same reason you might opt for cedar. It's rot resistant, it's got a natural look. I like that feeling of a cottage, and I just think it's pretty. It also goes really well with our house. We've got a brick house. It didn't pay to have any sort of vinyl siding or colored siding in the backyard. It wouldn't fit aesthetically. So, of course, once that all dried, it was time to start, and I started by trimming the insides of the windows and the doors, and then just the perimeter of the shed itself. I haven't talked about fasteners at all in this video so far, but it's important to mention right here that I'm using stainless steel nails, so they shouldn't be doing any rusting. Wouldn't you hate to put up this beautiful stuff and use the wrong nail and then see this runny rust coming from it? Oh, I'd be just heartbroken. Stainless steel is pretty expensive, but since it's a small project, it was okay to spend the extra buck and get the right thing. Stylistically, as I'm putting on the window, you see nothing fancy. I put the outsides on evenly and then the tops to cover those. There are a lot of different styles you could choose from. I got a lot of inspiration from Pinterest. I'd highly recommend that too, but I just chose to go with the style of architecture that mimics best what's on our house already. Here you can see me just lining up boards appropriately with the fascia that's already existing on the roof line. It's nice when you're doing this. The front faces the backyard, so you line up the sides first, and then you cover the ends of the side trim with the front board, like I'm doing right there. You don't see any seams. It looks really lovely. And when you're done, you fill in the gaps. Alright, the trim is on successfully. I'm moving on by marking out my studs based off of the cap nails that I have holding on the underlay. A chalk line would work just as well too, but it's important to mark those out as you're beginning to put up your siding, so you know that you're going into stud. I think you had to have at least, 1.5 inches penetration into a stud for proper holding on these. Now, check your manufacturer based off of what kind of siding you get. I have 1x8, so it's like 7.5 inches nominal width. I needed at least an inch overlap, so I gave, I think, 1.25 inches, 1.5 inches, so it's a 6-inch reveal on each board. And I did make myself a handy dandy little tool there that I can just hold up underneath each board and measure 6 inches evenly across. Every 4 boards I checked to make sure that they were perfectly level and the same height. That's important to check when you're going across a door or across a window, and making a couple markings to transfer over for the door frame and for the windows. We've got a close-up of that in just a minute. Well, I'll take this moment to give a shout out to my neighbors, who are great people. Nobody complained about all the hammering or anything. In fact, I got all the time, "Oh, what a beautiful play shed you're building for your daughter," which I had to chuckle. I think everybody and their brother said that, and our daughter loved playing in it, that's for sure. She still likes to play in it, but now it's filled with tools. That's just kind of a cool shot of me working on the back. I saved the quote-unquote ugliest pieces, or pieces that had some sort of deformities or needed to be filled with epoxy, etc. for the back bottom. That was nice. Here I am just working out how to get around this window. It's pretty straightforward. I put the board up there, mark where the ends are going to be, and then I transfer the markings over to my little jig there, which serves not only to make sure I have an even 6 inches separation between each board, but it's also kind of like a T-square that I can use and make markings on. So just a nice scrap jig to make, and you can see how perfectly those marks transfer to make a great fit. Once I'm done with the whole 12-foot front and back and the 8-foot sides, then I move into my scrap pile, find the nicer pieces, and I'm going and putting angled cuts here because these will be going up the peak of the roof, as we can see. And you know, this process, I think I spent about a day on each wall, doing it slowly, methodically, and in my opinion correctly. Every one of them had to have their own individual measurement, especially when you're going on either side of a window or door, because you can't just mass produce it. I found that at the top of the door, for example, one side was half an inch longer than the other side, but it started off even on the bottom. So it just, you know what I mean, you'll run into those little errors. Beautiful once the siding's on though, you know. My next steps were to move up to the roof. So code for my area says the drip edge on the front has to go on first. Then you put on the underlay, and once the underlay is on, you put your sides on top of the underlay. I think there's different terms for those, but you'll see what I mean. I know I'm right, even though there's a lot of heated debate on Reddit about what you're supposed to do, and apparently it's different state by state. Now, I'm using an ice and water barrier for the entirety of my roof, since it's only, I think, 3 rows worth, which is about what you do on a new house. Originally, I had just bought 15-pound felt paper, which is all I needed for code, but I'm in Wisconsin, we get a lot of ice and water, so I thought I'll just pay a little bit extra to get this nice material for the whole thing. It was adhesive on the bottom, incredibly hot. You know, it's tar and asphalt. My foreman said I was doing a very good job, though. I appreciated him laying in the cool grass, just being a sunbathing beauty, smiling at me, offering a lot of encouragement. Here's a good shot. The underlay is up there, and I'm putting the drip guard on top of that. Remember, when you're doing your drip guard, here's another thing. There's a lot of contradictory stuff on different YouTube videos and online. I chose to go with keeping the drip edge about a finger width away from the fascia, and then the asphalt shingles on top of that another half an inch away from the edge of the drip guard. You know, a hard driving rain will run off, but that slow stuff, you don't want the surface tension to bring it to your fascia board and then ruin that product a little bit quicker. Anyways, I've talked over me cutting my starter strip. Just making starter strips of shingles. It's really easy. You don't have to buy a starter strip. There's plenty extra. I'm doing Owens Corning shingles here, and they are top notch. There's that white strip that you can see is the nail strip. You don't have to figure out where your nail is supposed to go. Gosh, it's nice. And then the tar underneath goes right on the nail strip, and after one heat cycle they are bonded to each other. I think they can withstand 130 mile-an-hour winds. It's nuts. The excess that I cut off on one side I used to finish off the row on the other side, and I'm offsetting, I think, 6 or 8 inches, just eyeballing it with the shingles. And you can see the bald head of my buddy Sean underneath. He's holding the ladder as I'm standing on the step that says, "This is not a step." Right? We all do it. I shouldn't have picked on Sean there for being bald. He's a dear friend. Very handsome, very helpful, very talented. You can see he's helping me rip apart the caps for my shingles here too. Anyways, I'm doubling my shingle caps because I had extra ones and I got dedicated caps. You could of course just take your normal shingles and put them on the side, cut them in thirds and make a roof cap yourself, but I thought this was a nice finished touch. And it's specialty material, but since it's such a small roof, only about 150 square feet, it was practical enough from a financial standpoint to get something really nice. On to windows and doors. Here I found some exterior grade stained glass windows that were secondhand. These had been living outside for 7 years, according to the woman who I bought them from. I just think they're beautiful. They add a really nice touch. I don't need to be able to see in and out of the windows, but it does offer some wonderful diffuse light and interesting color, and it's a great palette. Again, it's kind of where form and function meet art and beauty with the shed. Quite pleased with it. It fits the space with about 1/8 of an inch clearance all around. And then I'm using L brackets to secure it, and I did use some clear silicone to caulk it when it was all said and done. Thumbs up! Oh, the door. The door caused me some issues. This is a door that I got from the Habitat for Humanity Restore for $35. It's solid wood. It is similar to the other doors on my house. My exterior door has 12 panels. This one has 9. Anyways, the nice part about using a wood door is you can trim it up to the needs of your frame there. And I had some trimming to do and some sanding to do, but essentially all this footage is me fine-tuning it. I did strip it, of course. I swapped out scratches and paint marks for watermarks, essentially, that came to the surface. But the watermarks look pretty cool in the end because they mimic the knots in the wood of the cedar. So here you can see it's sticking, and you can see that I've sanded up the edge pretty hefty. I just continue to do that, and then of course apply the stain and the exterior finish when I had that perfect fit. Isn't it satisfying just to see that clean palette get stained? I ended up staining it twice, so it was nice and dark, and then I put, I think, 3 coats of exterior finish over the course of 2 days, and then I waited for 2 days until it had completely cured. It's important to take that time, in my opinion. Do it right. I affixed the handle permanently, and that was a great handle to actually hold on and lift the door because it's pretty heavy. And then it was time to put the handle or the door on the shed. I opted to make these part of the hinges visible on the exterior, so I had some balance of metal on the left and the right. Just from a visual perspective, I think it looks quite beautiful. Otherwise, I could easily have just chiseled out some of the trim on the inside like you saw me doing to the door earlier. Here I am just putting in a door jamb from an extra piece of trim, so make sure the door doesn't ever get to swing on the inside, and notching out a hole and chiseling the space where that metal thing is supposed to go. Booyah! Perfect closure. Oh, was that satisfying? And then I open the door, and I close the door, and I open the door, and I close the door. One of the last things I had to do was make a ramp. I could have put a step up, but I'm going to be putting things like lawnmowers and snow blowers and bikes and things in here. A ramp just made more sense. It's about a 13-degree slope, so not ADA compliant, but it didn't need to be. And I had extra 2x6 treated boards, so I thought this is a perfect space to use them. And you can really just see I cut my 13-degree angle there at the front, buried the legs a little bit, had them settle, and I'm using exterior grade screws. This is the only part of the whole build where I'm using screws instead of nails. In case this does rot or I want to replace it with a different structure, all I have to do is unscrew it and move it away, and I don't have to worry about cutting around nails or anything. Charlotte, my daughter, loves going up and down the ramp. She'll say to us now, "Let's go sit on the porch," and she means to sit on the ramp in front of the shed. The final touch was to put some mulch around it, cover up the skids, and just make it look nice, clean up the nails and boards and trash and everything else I had around, and revel in the majesty of the shed. Look at that side. That's what we see from our fireplace, or the fire pit rather. Here's the view from the middle of the yard as it pans over essentially to the house. Look, you can see the other stained glass window from the inside. Magically, you're on the inside. At this point, we hadn't decided what we were going to do with the inside, whether we were going to insulate and do a sub-fascia or not, so you can see the studs in the walls, but it's a lot of space, and it feels so good to start with a clean palette, clean out the garage, build shelves in here, put things away, get organized. We've been thinking about this for 8 years, and the time was just right. If you want to see any of these parts in detail, I do recommend checking out the 9-part series, a couple deep dives on some of the more important topics. Like I said before, the bevel cedar siding is particularly good. Yes! Oh, it feels so good after all that time to finally be finished.
If you haven't gathered already, I'm extremely proud of it, and I hope you like it. So, have you done something like this before? I'd love to hear your project. If you've got a video of it on YouTube, put a link to it down in the comments below. I'll be sure to feature it, pin it as much as I can. I don't have shed envy anymore of other people. I have shed appreciation, and I hope this has been beneficial to you in some way. If nothing else, something entertaining to watch. Thanks a lot for stopping by. Like, subscribe, comment, all that jazz if you haven't. And be sure to check out anything in the 9-part series if you want a deeper dive, or that 4-minute time lapse as a review just for fun. Take care, guys. See you again.